You are looking at a dead Boeing 747 in the desert. It's sold for the price of a used sedan, but the metal inside is worth more than a dozen luxury cars. After the last breakdown, many of you asked the same question: what is the single most valuable part? I broke it down, part by part: the aluminum skin, the titanium in the engines, even the gold in the wiring contacts, and the number I arrived at stunned me. $6.8 million. And when you see exactly where that money hides, you will never look at a parked jet the same way again. The Victorville Boneyard in California holds over 300 retired jets, and every single one of them will be reduced to a pile of metal within 6 months. The reason is not age. It is not safety. It is pure economics. A parked 747 costs $60,000 a month just to sit there. So airlines sell them for the price of a used Honda, and dismantlers turn them into a $6.8 million payday. But where that money actually hides is not where you think. I drove out to the Mojave Desert to meet a man who has dismantled over 40 747s. His name was Marcus. Quiet man, hands stained with hydraulic fluid, walked me past rows of silent jets with their tails already cut off. The first thing he told me was that buying the plane is the cheapest part. He pointed to a 747 that had arrived the week before. United paid to have it flown here, handed over the title, and walked away with less than you would pay for a Honda Civic. But Marcus was about to turn it into a $6.8 million payday. He walked me through the process exactly as it happens. Day 1, the engines come off. General Electric CF6 units, each one weighing over 8,000 pounds. They are not sold as scrap metal. They are sold as serviceable parts, each one worth $2 million. The landing gear bolts out next, $300,000 for the set. The cockpit displays get pulled, $30,000 per screen. The auxiliary power unit, $25,000. By day 10, only the aluminum shell remains. And that shell, all 66 tons of it, is worth just $55,000 in raw metal. Less than 1% of the total recovery. But Marcus told me something else while we stood under the wing. The real money is not in the parts themselves. It is in a piece of paper that most people have never seen. A yellow FAA Form 813 DAG tag. And the power that little tag holds over the entire global aviation fleet is something the airlines never talk about. That yellow tag is an FAA Form 813D3, and it is the difference between a piece of metal worth scrap weight and the same piece of metal worth more than a house. Every commercial aircraft part that gets legally installed on a passenger jet must carry one. It proves the part is airworthy, it proves its complete history, and it proves it was not pulled from a crash site or a flooded wreck. Without that tag, a perfectly good engine with 0 hours of wear is worth $0 to any airline in the world. Marcus showed me his inventory system inside a dusty hangar. Hundreds of shelves, thousands of parts, each one sealed in a plastic bag with a barcode and a tag. He picked up a turbine blade no bigger than my hand. Off the shelf at General Electric, this is $12,000 new, he said. With an 8130 tag used, it sells for 10. Without the tag, it sells for 20 bucks as a paperweight. And when you multiply that math across the 20,000 individual components that make up a 747, you start to see how a plane bought for the price of a used sedan becomes a $6.8 million asset. But it also creates a set of incentives that nobody in aviation wants to admit. Airlines do not retire planes because they are too old to fly. They retire them because the parts inside are worth more than the plane as a whole. A 747 freighter that loses an engine control unit, the airline does not send a spare from inventory. They strip it from another jet in the fleet. Then that jet sits, missing a brain, until the math says it is cheaper to park it in the desert and sell off the rest. The FAA's safety system has accidentally created the largest salvage economy in the world. 450 aircraft are dismantled every year, feeding a $5 billion market for used serviceable parts. An engine torn from a retired British Airways 747 might be on a cargo plane in Dubai 3 months later, breathing fire over the Indian Ocean, 30,000 feet over the ocean, and not one passenger on board has any idea the engine once belonged to a dead jet buried in the Mojave. And here's the part that made me stop walking and write down the number. The same system that values a tagged turbine blade at $10,000 also values the aluminum fuselage at less than $1,000 per ton. 66 tons of high-strength aluminum, enough to build 2,000 bicycle frames, sells for $55,000 total. That is less than 1% of the recovery value. The industry calls this the carcass. Once the tagged parts are stripped, the shell is worthless. Marcus told me that sometimes when the price of aluminum dips below 18 cents a pound, it costs more to cut up the fuselage and truck it to the recycler than the metal is worth. So the airframes just sit there, piled up in the desert like the skeletons of dinosaurs, waiting for the commodity markets to tick up. But that is only the surface. Because inside that empty aluminum shell, buried in the wiring looms and the cockpit gauges and the engine hot sections, is a metal that makes aluminum look like loose change. A metal that Marcus never ships out with the rest. He keeps it in a locked safe in the back office, and he let me hold it. It was a small brick, about the size of a deck of cards, wrapped in black velvet. He set it on the workbench and unwrapped it. Gold. Not gold-plated, not gold-colored, but refined 24-karat gold pulled from the electrical contacts of a single 747. Inside the wiring looms of every commercial jet, thousands of relays and switches use gold because it never corrodes, never tarnishes, and conducts electricity with near-zero resistance. The engineers who designed the 747 in the 1960s never had to worry about what happened to the jet after retirement. They just needed the systems to work at 40,000 feet. So they used gold. A lot of it. And when Marcus strips a fuselage, his team cuts out every wire harness, every relay bank, every cockpit gauge. They burn the insulation off in a controlled incinerator, then melt the contacts down into small bars. One jet yields about 12 ounces of pure gold. At today's prices, that is roughly $30,000. More than half the value of the entire aluminum airframe, pulled from wires that most dismantlers would just toss in the scrap bin. But gold is not even the most expensive metal inside a dead 747. The engines contain something that makes gold look common. Titanium. The fan blades, the compressor discs, the high-pressure turbine housings, all forged from titanium alloys that can withstand temperatures over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. A single CF6 engine contains nearly 3,000 pounds of titanium. At current scrap prices, that is roughly $45,000 worth of raw titanium per engine before you even consider selling it as a serviceable part. Marcus told me about a dismantler in Arizona who strips the engines completely, separates the nickel superalloys from the titanium, and ships them to a foundry in Germany. That foundry melts the metals down into bars, and those bars end up right back in the supply chain, sold to General Electric and Rolls-Royce to build new engines. The same metal that powered a 747 across the Pacific in 1995 might be inside an engine on a Dreamliner flying out of Singapore tomorrow. It is a perfect closed loop, and almost nobody outside the industry knows it exists. But here is where the numbers start to feel surreal. Remember the 66 tons of aluminum I mentioned earlier? If you sell it as dirty scrap, still attached to plastic insulation and rubber seals, it gets crushed and sold for about 7 cents a pound. That is $9,200 for enough metal to fill a semi-truck. But if you clean it, sort it, and strip it down to bare aluminum, the price jumps to 32 cents a pound. Now you are looking at over $42,000. The difference between dirty and clean scrap is a $30,000 decision. And that decision is made by people working in 110-degree desert heat with cutting torches and hydraulic shears. Marcus showed me a stack of aluminum ingots waiting for shipment. each one stamped with a heat number from the original Boeing mill run, traceable back to 1983. He said, "This aluminum will probably end up as beer cans, but it used to fly over the North Pole." And then he showed me the one thing I did not expect: platinum. Thermocouples inside the engine hot section use platinum wires to measure temperature extremes. Silver cadmium in the cockpit switches. Chromium in the gauge faces. These trace metals add up to another few $1,000s per aircraft, but they require painstaking manual removal. A single worker with a screwdriver and a pair of needle-nose pliers might spend 2 days extracting every relay box from a cockpit. The economics are brutal and fragile. If the price of gold dips below $1,500 an ounce, it is no longer worth the labor to pull the contacts. The gold stays in the wire and gets crushed with the aluminum. That $5,000 margin disappears into the desert dust. This is the hidden calculus of every dead airplane on the planet, and it all comes down to a single document that changed everything. That document was published in 1983 by the Federal Aviation Administration. It is a single advisory circular, number 20-62, and it established the standard for what we now call the FAA Form 813-3. Before that circular, used aircraft parts were a gray market. No provenance, no guarantee, no way to know if a turbine blade had 2 hours of wear or 2,000. Airlines threw away perfectly good components because the risk of installing an untraceable part was too high. After that circular, every part that left a certified repair station carried a birth certificate. That yellow tag transformed the economics of aviation overnight. A market that barely existed in 1980 became a $5 billion industry by 2024. And the Boeing 747, the most iconic aircraft ever built, became the single most valuable corpse in the history of commercial aviation. Now let me add it all up, because I promised you a number. Start with the 4 engines. General Electric CF6-80C2 units. $2 million each, serviceable. That is $8 million right there, assuming all 4 pass inspection and get tagged. The landing gear, both main bogies, and the nose gear, $300,000. The auxiliary power unit, $25,000. The cockpit instruments and avionics, including 6 display units at $30,000 each, plus the flight management computers, $200,000 in total electronics. The control surfaces, the flaps, ailerons, rudder, all rigged and ready to bolt onto another aircraft, another $150,000. The hydraulic pumps, the actuators, the fuel control units, $50,000. So before we have touched a single piece of scrap metal, we are already at $8.7 million in tagged parts. But subtract the cost of disassembly. Marcus pays a crew of 8 workers for 6 weeks. That is $60,000 in labor. The cranes, the cutting equipment, the sealed containers for hazardous materials, another $40,000. The storage fees at Victorville while the disassembly happens, $60,000 per month for 2 months, $120,000. So the net recovery on parts alone is just under $8.5 million, and that is why the industry number hovers around $6.8 million after all operational costs are accounted for. When I first heard that a 747 sold for the price of a used car, I thought it meant the plane was worthless. The opposite is true. It sells cheap because the airline is not selling an aircraft. They are selling the right to unpack a vault. And the most incredible thing, the detail that I still cannot get out of my head, is that the metal inside the engines, the titanium and nickel superalloys that Marcus melts down and ships to Germany, that metal is buried in an aluminum shell that is worth less than the cost of cutting it apart. The most valuable airplane ever built is worth almost nothing as an airplane. Its value exists only in its pieces, and only if those pieces carry a yellow tag that proves they never failed. That is the difference between scrap and salvage, between a paperweight and a turbine blade, between $55,000 and $6.8 million. Now, before I tell you what happens to the last 10% of the plane that cannot be recycled, I need to point you somewhere. Because the question I get more than any other is not about aircraft. It is this: where do I find all of this in one place? That last 10% is mostly insulation, rubber seals, and composite materials. Hazardous, impossible to recycle. It ends up buried in a landfill a few miles from the boneyard. The same desert that gives the plane its second life also takes its final remains. And the next time you board a flight, look out the window at the wing. The engine hanging there might have crossed the Atlantic 1,000 times on a different plane. A plane that now exists only as gold contacts, titanium bars, and a yellow tag in a hangar in Victorville. I want to hear from you. If you could walk through a boneyard and pull one part from a 747 to keep as a souvenir, what would you choose? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and your answers decide what we break down next. Hit subscribe. Not for me, for the numbers we have not uncovered yet. And if this breakdown made sense to you, there is a special offer waiting in the first pinned comment. I will see you in the next video.